what they say is true or not. In the cases where we can determine it, it turns out that's almost always true. So in the cases where we can't determine it, we know they're credible, and we trust them. Remember, almost everything you know because other people told you. Those things that other people told you, you can't check. That there was an American Civil War, you can't check. That Caesar lived and walked the earth with the Roman armies, you can't check. You can't check the population of China today. All these things you can't check. And yet you trust them. How do you decide whether to trust them? Because when these very same sources of information tell you something that you can check, turns out to be true, then you trust them when you can't check it. Witnesses like this, are 25 years old, and are educated and emotionally stable with no addictions and no interest, witnesses like this, when we can check, get it right. So we trust them when we can't check it. That's how we decide to accept information that people tell us. This is what we do in all of life. What would happen if you have a source of information? Some items you can check and some items you can't. What would happen if from that source of information, every item you can check turns out to be true? Every one. Then you would have enormous credibility for the items you can't check. And that would be strong, positive, empirical, to use the code word, evidence that you should trust the source of information on those items that you cannot check. It itself becomes reason to accept that those reports are true. Are we together so far? I hope this all sounds boringly obvious, because now I'm ready to draw the conclusion. The event at Sinai, the information about the event at Sinai comes from a source, all of whose checkable instances are true. It comes from exactly such a source of information. And therefore, this particular item of information, which isn't directly checkable, has tremendous credibility. The crucial thing to get, this is the only slightly complicated element in the point, is to pinpoint the source of information correctly. The source of information is a national tradition about a national experience that would change the life of the nation. Let's take that apart piece by piece. The source of information, a national tradition, I mean a nation that believes something. The nation as a whole believes something about its own past, not about somebody else. You do have, in some cases, tradition where nation A believes something about nation B. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where nation A believes something about its own past. And what it believes is that in the past, its ancestors had a national experience. Now, by a national experience, I mean every man, woman, and child experienced it directly. Not by hearsay, not by reputation, not by effect, but every man, woman, and child experienced it directly. And it's the kind of experience that would change the life of the nation. That's the kind of source, that's the particular source that I'm talking about. My claim is that every piece of information that comes from that source, that is, every piece of information which is a national tradition, about a national experience, which would change the life of the nation, every one of them that we can check, is in fact true. Since every one of them that we can check is true, this source, the source of national traditions about national experiences that would change the life of the nation, that source has tremendous credibility. And therefore, when that source tells me about another event that I can't check independently, I have tremendous empirical evidence that the report is true. Let's see what we're talking about in terms of this source. National traditions about national experiences. This includes defeat in war. Watch why I say defeat in war. In ancient times, if two countries had a war, the victorious army occupied the territory of the defeated army and broke down its cities and raped its women and stole its treasures and set up a tax system where they have to pay taxes. Everyone in a defeated country knew they were defeated. For the victors, that's not true. The defeated and the victors may live 100 miles apart. The victors sent their army, and destroyed the defeated and destroyed their city. People at home only know what the army chooses to tell them when they come back. That's not a national experience for the victorious side. That's just a report from the army. We're not talking about that. We're talking about every man, woman, and child experiences it directly. Or pestilence. The Black Death in Europe, in 10 years, 30% of European population died in 10 years. Everyone in Europe knew about it because 30% died and everybody else saw people dying all around them. That's a direct experience of the whole population. Technological invention. Someone invents something and then it spreads through the entire population. That's an experience of everyone in the population. I'm talking about national traditions of national experiences like this. Notice, this source of information has nothing to do with religion, it has nothing to do with revelation, it has nothing to do with Judaism, nothing to do with Hebrew, nothing to do with the ancient Near East. This is a general source of human information, which you have all over the world. Now, the final condition is that it's got to be the kind of experience that would change the life of the nation. What I mean to exclude here are things like, for example, solar eclipses. Every nation experienced solar eclipses from time to time. Very, very few made records of them. A solar eclipse was a shocking, frightening event. But people recognized after a while that after the eclipse, things went on pretty much the way they did before the eclipse. The crops kept growing, and people kept having babies, and the king kept collecting taxes, and people continued to be born and die. And so, although it was shocking when it happened, people didn't make records of it. The event didn't change the life of the nation in any substantial way. I want to rule those out as well. I want national experiences, national traditions about national experiences, or national experience means every man, woman, and child experiences it directly. Of events that would change the life of the nation. Now, I claim that every one of them that we can check is true. How do I know this? I did a survey of myths in the ancient world. There's a book called Bulfinch's Mythology. 780 pages of myths in the ancient world. Not a single one is of this type. Not one. Indeed, in the entire book, there are only 2 myths which were national traditions. But in both cases, there were national traditions about some other nation's national experience. In Greece, you had a myth about something that happened in Crete. And in England, you had a myth about something that happened in France. Then I looked at Egyptian myths, and I looked at myths from the Americas. There's a book that was put out in England about 10 years ago called The Invention of Tradition. 8 modern traditions that were invented. Someone sent it to me and said, look, you're talking about traditions that can't be wrong. Here they've documented 8 traditions that have been invented. It's true. Every one of them has been invented, and not a single one fits my category. Not a single one fits this definition. It wasn't a national tradition about a national experience that would change the life of the nation. So I went through the whole thing. I have this written up. And I thank the person for sending me the book. It confirms my thesis. Because these invented traditions, every one of them, isn't of this kind. If it isn't of this kind, all bets are off. For my money, you can make up that the moon is made of green cheese. Because it's not this kind of tradition. So when you have a national tradition, and these include, as I said, wars and sometimes migrations and pestilences and the rest, these are things which, when we can check them, and sometimes we can. We can check them against the records of other nations. We can check them against their archaeology. These turn out to be right. Other myths turn out to be wrong, but these turn out to be right. Notice, by the way, that the traditions of other religions don't fit this description. In particular, the miracles that are associated with the founder of Christianity. In order to verify this, I had to go through their sources. The largest number of people that is asserted to have attended such a miracle is 5,000. 5,000 in a local population of hundreds of thousands of people. It's a tiny, tiny percentage. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a national experience, a national tradition, about a national experience where the nation as a whole, every man, woman, and child experiences it. There's nothing remotely resembling that in their religious tradition. So this argument that I'm presenting will have nothing to do with their traditions. Their traditions will have to be examined some other way. Now, let me just finish the point here, and then I'm happy to discuss it. Now, let's just take a look at the story of Sinai. What kind of story is it? Well, it says in the text explicitly that every man, woman, and child heard God speak. It says it at least 10 times. And part of the revelation was that from now on there has to be a weekly holiday. Every Saturday is a holiday. That's definitely going to change the life of the nation. Next Saturday isn't going to be like last Saturday. And until maybe 300 years ago, the entire Jewish nation believed it. It's very interesting. In the Tanakh, the Bible, 1,000 pages worth, there are many heresies. There are many groups that rebelled against the Torah, rebelled against the authorities, practiced various forms of idol worship. Not once did any group or any individual say that the revelation at Sinai is a myth. Not once. The Talmud records a variety of heresies of various kinds. Not once is there a hint that anyone questioned the revelation at Sinai. Not to mention, as a point of a footnote of interest, that the entire Christian and Muslim world accepted without question. So you have millennia of the Jewish nation accepting this without question. So you have a very strong, long-standing national tradition, that a certain national experience took place, and a national experience that would definitely change the life of the nation. That being the case, it's coming from a source of information which is very highly credible, because every case that I can check turns out to be true. And that being the case, I have very strong empirical evidence that it's true. Let me just stop to make one more comment, and then we'll discuss it. I don't know how this happens, but I've been quoted and criticized as saying that I'm assuming that what the Torah says is true, and that's how I know that it happened. I hope that sounds like Alice in Wonderland to you. I'm certainly not assuming that what the Torah says is true. What I'm talking about is the content of the story. What kind of story is it? When I examine what kind of story it is, I'm not assuming that it's true or false. I don't make any assumptions whatsoever. I want to know what kind of story it is. Why do I want to know what kind of story it is? Because the source of information I'm considering is a source of information about stories of a particular kind. I trust it because it's a record of that kind of story. So I want to make sure that the revelation of Sinai is that kind of story. I'm taking the text only to tell me what kind of story it is. The reason for accepting that it's a true story is that it comes from a source of information, all of whose checkable cases checks out to be true. And therefore that source of information is very strong, and therefore I have adequate evidence to accept what it delivers in cases where I can't check, just like the two witnesses who testify against Peter that he killed Paul. Okay. Now, questions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Coming from the outside, I've allowed you to sink in the three-pronged approach. You have national tradition, national experience, change the nation. I've allowed it to permeate me and sink in, and from someone from the outside, I can see why this is what would bring somebody in to really feel and see this. And I did not been here before. For some, I'd like to know also if there was somebody who was free from birth, who wasn't from the outside, like I am, and to hear this, because there's always that cynic in me that I'm hearing it and I can understand it, totally bang on, makes perfect sense to me. And I wonder if somebody had known Frumkeit for a long time and they had a question about this event, about Sinai, and they asked the question, would they be told this as an answer?
Well, look, you're asking a sociological question about our educational institutions. That's not my. I'm sorry, that's not my interest. My interest is not that.
My question is there another way of saying
I've presented this argument. I want to know whether this argument is valid and accurate, and whether there are questions about clarifying it. I'm not doing sociology of our education now. That's a separate subject. Yeah.
When you use the idea of the London Times as being a credible newspaper because of what you've seen, the idea of being media literate is to look at one